Welcome, curious minds and history buffs alike. Settle in, maybe give your own hair or wig a little tug of admiration, because today we're diving head first into a world where hairstyles weren't just about looking good on a Friday night. Oh no, ancient hairstyles were a whole language of their own. Imagine that, your carefully crafted braid or towering topknot wasn't just a fashion statement, but a billboard flashing your social status, your family allegiance, your religious beliefs, and sometimes even your readiness for war or marriage. Before you scoff at those ancient folks spending hours fixing their hair, consider this. Without smartphones, hashtags, or tweets, they had to find other ways to broadcast who they were. Enter the wig, the braid, the twist, the topknot, a stunningly elaborate set of codes, woven with sweat, grit, and sometimes human hair. It sounds almost absurd by today's standards. We slap on a hat or pull our hair into a messy bun and call it a day. But back then, your hairstyle was your resume, your social media profile, and your battle flag rolled into one. Picture ancient Egypt, where the wig was king. Literally. Egyptians didn't just grow hair, they crafted it into art forms that could make even today's celebrity hairstylists green with envy. But wigs weren't just for vanity or catching the breeze under a scorching sun. No, for them, wigs were about identity and ritual purity. Pharaohs flaunted elaborate wigs, studded with gold and precious stones, signaling divine authority and untouchable status. Commoners, meanwhile, might wear wigs to emulate the elite or to trick lice. And yes, lice were the original party crashers of antiquity. Imagine trying to command an empire with itchy bugs ruining your royal coiffure. Travel east to ancient China, and topknots become the hairstyle's secret code. These weren't mere hair buns, but carefully calibrated declarations. A man's topknot could indicate his clan, what stage of life he was in, or if he was even ready to fight, marry, or mourn. The longer the topknot, the stronger the statement it made. Something like ancient Twitter, but with much more hair and a lot less strolling. Warriors decorated their locks with beads and metal, turning their heads into mobile billboards of intimidation and honor. No need for battle cries when your hairstyle screams, "Don't mess with me." Now, cross over to Africa, where braiding was, and still is, so much more than decoration. Braids were the social network of their day, conveying age, marital status, wealth, religion, and even political stance. And the ingenuity. Braiders could create patterns so intricate they rivaled modern lacework, each braid a message encoded in strands of hair. It wasn't just a hairstyle, it was a living document, passed down through generations, worn proudly as a badge of identity and survival. Think of it as a hairstyle with Wi-Fi, connecting families, communities, and tribes in a shared cultural web. And then, of course, there's ancient Rome, where hairstyles were almost a spectator sport. Roman women competed to create towering hair pyramids, replete with curls, ribbons, and sometimes even tiny figurines tucked in for good measure. It wasn't just about looking good for dinner parties. These elaborate styles boldly telegraphed wealth and leisure time. Because, let's face it, only the rich could afford hours in the salon, not to mention the armies of slaves styling their hair. On the flip side, gladiators often shaved their heads as a mark of their brutal profession, signaling toughness and their readiness to throw down in the arena. Hair here was a clear demarcation between power, luxury, and survival. Even in the far reaches of Northern Europe, hairstyles carved out niches of identity and belief. Vikings, often imagined as wild and unkempt, were surprisingly meticulous about their braids and topknots. Their hairstyles carried spiritual weight, warding off evil spirits and signifying their rank within the tribe. It's hard to picture a battle-hardened Viking without his signature braids, which were as much a part of his toolkit as an axe or shield. A missing braid might just mean you've lost face, or worse, your life. What so fascinated me about ancient hairstyles is how they turned a seemingly trivial daily routine into a layered, and I mean that literally, system of codes. Hairstyles could signal everything from mourning the dead to celebrating a victory, staking out property rights, or even indicating alliances between rival tribes. They weren't just protective facades or aesthetics. They were powerful social instruments, knitting together communities in ways words never could. Hair became a currency of power, a dialogue without speech, and sometimes a weapon in the arsenal of cultural survival. So next time you glance in the mirror and consider your style, remember that you're part of a millennia-old tradition of making hair speak volumes about who you are, even when you're silent. Ancient civilizations didn't just style their hair, they told stories, forged identities, asserted power, and navigated complex social worlds, all without uttering a word. Wigs, braids, and topknots were ancient tweets, Instagram posts, and press conferences rolled into one, only way more intricate and a lot itchier. In this series, we'll unravel these stories strand by strand, exploring not just how these hairstyles looked, but what they said, who they were for, and why they mattered so much. Think of it as unlocking a secret language written in hair, sometimes elegant, sometimes savage, always fascinating. Because at the end of the day, in the grand theater of history, hair wasn't just on their heads, it was in their hearts, their identities, and their very souls. And that's a story worth telling. Imagine stepping into the scorching sun of ancient Egypt, where the Nile's life-giving waters shimmer just beyond the palace walls, and every strand of hair, real or artificial, whispers secrets about power, divinity, and social standing. Hair in Egypt wasn't just hair, it was a billboard broadcasting who you were, who you hoped to be, and sometimes who you feared you were not. The ancient Egyptians didn't mess around with casual bedhead. No lazy ponytails or haphazard man buns here. Instead, hairstyles were elaborate, meticulously crafted statements that blended art, religion, and politics into every curl, braid, and wig. Pharaohs didn't merely wear crowns. Their hairstyles were crowns themselves, woven with symbolism and sprayed with the aura of godlike authority. Wigs were the rage, but not the disco kind. These were crafted with such precision and care that you could almost mistake them for living hair. Made from human hair, sometimes mixed with vegetable fibers or wool, these wigs could be dyed jet black or a rich brown to mimic the ideal shiny locks associated with youth and vitality, because nothing screamed, "I'm the son of Ra," quite like gleaming, perfect hair. And talk about convenience. Wigs saved nobility the trouble of dealing with lice, a persistent plague in ancient Egypt. So they shaved their heads bald to keep pests at bay, and then topped those clean canvases with wigs that doubled as royal insignia. But wigs were far from one size fits all. Each style conveyed a distinct message. A visitor to the court could read a person's rank like a coded script. Priestesses, for example, often sported a unique tripartite wig, split into 3 sections that framed the face and shoulders, a style thought to invoke the goddess Isis herself and suggest a direct connection to divine wisdom. Meanwhile, pharaohs often combined wigs with elaborate headdresses studded with symbols of protection, like the cobra or vulture, announcing their divine right to rule with unmistakable flair. Now, when we say braids, don't picture a simple braid you might toss into a bun before a yoga class. Egyptian braids were intricate and precise, winding around the head in carefully measured patterns. They represented more than vanity. They represented status and identity. Nobles and officials might adorn their braids with beads made of gold or faience, glazed ceramic beads that gleamed like tiny jewels under the relentless sun. Each bead and braid had its place in the social tapestry, like a badge of honor or subtle flex. But what about the roots of these styles? Hair rituals in ancient Egypt were serious business. Hair was seen not just as physical adornment, but as a spiritual conduit, a symbol of life itself. To cut someone's hair recklessly or badly was almost sacrilegious. It could sever their connection to the gods or invite misfortune. The act of haircutting was reserved for specific rites: mourning, initiation, or rebirth. Shaving heads could signify humility or purification, while growing and styling could symbolize strength and continuity. Consider the priestesses who lived in temple complexes, where daily hair care was practically a ritualistic act. They bathed their locks in perfumed oils made from fragrant plants like cedar, myrrh, and lotus, antiseptic mixtures that filtered out not just dirt, but impurities of body and spirit. Their hairstyles were as much about projecting sanctity and otherworldly grace as they were about adhering to social codes. Hair for them was a living altar. Pharaohs took these ideas to an even more dramatic extreme. The famous false beard, often seen in statues and reliefs, is not just a fashion statement, but part of the royal coiffure, symbolizing wisdom and masculinity. Even queens wore versions of this beard to symbolize their participation in the divine kingship. Some wigs featured metal threads or had beads shaped like tiny, sacred animals woven in, adding another layer of supernatural swagger to their appearance. Hair didn't merely reflect individual piety or style, but was a carefully calibrated political tool. Imagine the palace gossip. Did you see how the new vizier's wig drooped today? That's a bad omen for his career. The right hair could intimidate rivals and impress foreign dignitaries. It was a public broadcast in a world without Instagram. Your hair said everything. It shouted your lineage, your wealth, your connections, your spiritual alignment. So, in a culture obsessed with order, ma'at, the regulation, upkeep, and display of hair was part ritual, part strategy, and part dazzling performance. Hair was an art form that demonstrated personal and cosmic order. The perfect curl was a reflection of the perfect state. Messy hair, chaos, disorder, and potentially an invitation to the wrath of the gods. In other words, ancient Egyptian hairstyles were the original billboard for social hierarchy and divine favor, way before influencers and fashion magazines showed up. Wigs, braids, and crowned topknots functioned as living symbols, worn like badges of identity, power, and sacred authority. The art of hair was a language, understood by all, but spoken only by the elite few who mastered its nuanced grammar. And next time someone complains about bad hair days, remember, in ancient Egypt, that was more than just a fashion faux pas. It could be a cosmic disaster. Imagine a world where your hairstyle wasn't just about looking good at a summer barbecue or trying to impress that cute neighbor down the street. No, in ancient Mesopotamia, your hair was a walking billboard advertising your social status, political allegiance, and even your spiritual beliefs. All braided, twisted, and looped with deliberate care. The city-states of Mesopotamia, sprawling between the Tigris and Euphrates, were buzzing arenas where identity could be literally read on your head. Mesopotamian hairstyles were far from accidental. Each braid and coil was a statement, a language more complex than any tweet or Instagram caption. Picture this: a young man with his hair meticulously parted into tight, symmetrical braids cascading over his shoulders. That was not just a fashion choice. It was an open declaration of his citizenship in Uruk or Lagash, one of the many fiercely independent city-states that dotted the Fertile Crescent like jewels on a necklace. These braiding patterns weren't reinvented for every celebrity appearance. They were long-established codes, passed down through generations. This wasn't beauty for beauty's sake. Hairstyles in Mesopotamia communicated who you were, where you belonged, and crucially, what you were allowed to do. They broadcast your legal standing in a world where laws were etched not just in stone tablets, but woven into your very appearance. Braids served as a kind of social ID badge. Married men might wear their hair differently from warriors, and priests had their sacred coiffures that set them apart during religious ceremonies. It was like the ultimate dress code, except you couldn't just swap out your hairdo like you do socks. Imagine being a soldier in the city-state of Kish. Your hair wasn't left to flounder like some unruly mane in a windstorm. No, it was carefully styled into topknots or tight braids, practical for battle, but laden with symbolism. The military ranks were visibly marked by the awkwardly impressive shapes of their braids. Warriors flaunted hair designs that signaled not only their bravery, but their readiness to protect the city's walls and temples. The tighter and more intricate the braid, the fiercer the fighter. Think of it as ancient Mesopotamian tamo mixed with a military uniform, except way cooler because it combined artistry, allegiance, and intimidation all in one. The religious leaders, or priests, didn't just wear any wig, braid, or topknot either. Their hairstyles were infused with spiritual significance and ritual meaning. In Mesopotamian culture, with its pantheon of gods and goddesses demanding eternal respect, the way you presented your hair during worship was a sign of piety. Intricately styled hair could appease the gods or mark you as an intermediary between mortals and the divine. Some priests were known to weave hair with beads or even ribbons dyed with precious pigments. Imagine spending hours just to braid your hair with tiny lapis lazuli beads, all so you looked like a walking altar. Talk about commitment to the faith. But let's not fool ourselves into thinking these hairstyles were all bliss and beauty. They often demanded hours of painful attention. Those braids could tug and pull so tightly that it was a constant, nagging reminder of social order. It was hair discipline, literally. You could say these styles were early forms of tough love, an outward expression of who had power and who was expected to conform. If your hair was messy, you might be perceived as lazy, disloyal, or worse, an outcast unworthy of city privileges. And speaking of privileges, some hairstyles were literally exclusive. Women, especially those from the elite classes of cities like Babylon or Nippur, sported elaborate braided crowns or buns that women of lower status simply couldn't touch. Their hairstyles set them apart at festivals and banquets. These intricate designs served as social markers, much like designer handbags do today, except without the option to splurge on fakes. The complexity of a woman's braid could hint at her family's wealth, her role in religious ceremonies, or even her marital prospects. So, yeah, if you wanted to snag the equivalent of a royal matchmaking contract, better start practicing those braids. And it wasn't just the urban elites who cared. Laborers and craftsmen might have simpler styles, but even their hair wasn't left wild or plain. A braided line here or a knotted topknot there could say something about the guild they belonged to or their rank within it. In a region where every city-state was deeply competitive, vying for resources, land, and divine favor, maintaining these hair codes was a practical way to navigate complex social waters. Defying hairstyle norms could get you into trouble faster than a gladiator's dagger to the gut. If you think this sounds like a lot of fuss over hair, consider the fact that some Mesopotamian statutes literally regulated hairstyles. That's right, they wrote up rules, carved them onto clay tablets, and sent officials around to make sure people were keeping their braids straight and their top knots high. Imagine a hair police force that ensured no rebellious teenager tried to go rogue with a novel haircut. Penalties ranged from fines to public humiliation. Clearly, your hair could cost you more than just needless stress. It could cost you your dignity, your membership in the community, even your livelihood. As if all this wasn't fascinating enough, archaeological finds from ancient Mesopotamian tombs reveal beautifully preserved wigs and hairpieces, some fashioned from human hair, others from wool. These wigs allowed wearers to emulate the intricate braiding styles without spending the time or enduring the scalp agony. That's right, fake hair isn't exactly a 21st century invention. Some wigs were extravagantly styled to show off status, used during both daily life and ceremonial occasions. It was the ancient equivalent of a power suit or a pair of killer heels. You could say Mesopotamians were the original trendsetters in hair accessories. And yes, they knew a thing or two about vanity. So, when next you imagine ancient Mesopotamia, don't just picture their ziggurats, cuneiform tablets, or law codes. Picture those complex braids, those stiff top knots, those woven strands that told the story of citizenship, military might, and religious devotion. The symbolic language of these hairstyles was loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. They were a daily reminder that in a world shaped by gods and kings, your hair was your personal billboard, and everyone was watching. Imagine the samurai stepping onto the battlefield, not just armored with steel and tempered resolve, but crowned with a hairstyle that spoke volumes before a single arrow was loosed or sword swung. The topknot, or chanmage, was far more than a quirky hairdo. It was an unspoken badge of honor, a silent emblem of discipline and social standing woven into the very fabric of feudal Japan's warrior culture. At first glance, the chanmage might seem like a bewildering anachronism, the samurai's hair shaved at the front and gathered into a tightly bound knot on top of the head, almost theatrical but undeniably intentional. It was a hairstyle designed not just to look sharp, although, let's admit it, they pulled it off with style, but to serve a practical purpose. The shaved crown made the samurai's helmet sit more comfortably. Without that awkward lump of hair under the kabuto, the helmet didn't slide or pinch mid-fight. But practical function was only the beginning. Like a carefully choreographed dance between form and meaning, the chonmage communicated a clear and rigid social code. Samurai were not simply warriors, they were the embodiment of Bushido, the way of the warrior, an ethic that prized loyalty, honor, and discipline above all else. Sporting a topknot was like wearing a uniform in the most literal sense. It immediately marked the wearer as belonging to a unique caste, a warrior elite set apart from peasants, merchants, or even court nobles. The hairstyle was a visual declaration. I live by a code. I am trained for battle, and I am worthy of respect or fear. Interestingly, not all samurai wore their topknots the same way. The size, shape, and even the way the hair was tied could hint at the wearer's rank, region, or allegiance. It was a hair status symbol, if you will, a 17th century Instagram filter showing loyalty and prestige before smartphones made it cool. Lower-ranking samurai might tie a modest knot, small and practical, while shoguns and high-ranking warriors sported grander, more elaborate versions. Think of it as the medieval Japanese equivalent of a luxury watch or a customized car, flamboyant yet functional badges of distinction. But, as with all codes that intertwine so deeply with identity, the chonmage wasn't just about external appearances. Its upkeep was ritualistic, almost meditative, reflecting the samurai's internal discipline. Hair was carefully oiled, combed, and maintained to perfection. Letting the top knot go messy, or worse, allowing it to fall out of place, was a sign of disrespect, not just to one's appearance, but to one's family, one's lord, and the warrior code itself. Imagine the pressure. One wrong hair day, and you could be questioning your honor, or worse, inviting ridicule. The symbolism of the top knot was so deeply ingrained that an enemy's ability to cut off the chonmage was a devastating act of shame. During battle or capture, severing a samurai's top knot was like stripping away his identity, honor, and social standing all at once. It was a brutal psychological weapon, a swift public declaration of defeat and disgrace. Suddenly, you weren't a fierce warrior anymore. You were stripped down to a dishonored man, a fate worse than death in many samurai circles. The chonmage also reflected a fascinating tension between rigidity and rebellion. While it codified belonging, the hairstyle was also a visual battleground for cultural changes and resistance. During the peaceful Edo period, when battles were fewer and social order was more strictly enforced, the chonmage became a symbol of order and control. It was the hairstyle of the established system, reinforcing hierarchy and submission to the shogunate's rule. Yet, as the centuries marched on, the chonmage became ripe for satire and even quiet subversion. As non-samurai classes and merchants sought social mobility, mimicking the topknot in cheap or exaggerated forms became a way to mock or question the very system that had long kept them in place. It was the medieval equivalent of dressing up as your boss for Halloween, not always respectful, but undeniably telling. One of the most intriguing paradoxes lies in how the chonmage, a mark of rigidity and tradition, managed to become a dynamic symbol during Japan's rapid modernization. When the Meiji Restoration rolled in during the 19th century, sweeping away the samurai class and their privileges in an effort to westernize and centralize power, the topknot became an instant anachronism and a target. Samurai were forced to cut off their chonmage, symbolically disarming themselves of their old identity and bowing to the new era's demands. For many, this was a wrenching loss. The moment a topknot was severed was akin to a soldier laying down his sword after centuries of wielding it. In a society where appearances were laden with meaning, the chonmage's fall from grace mirrored the twilight of an era. But even today, when topknots appear on sumo wrestlers or in historical dramas, they carry the echoes of that code: pride, honor, discipline, and the deeply human desire to belong to something greater than oneself through the symbolic language of hair. So next time you see a picture of a samurai, pay close attention to the topknot perched on his head. It's not just hair, it's a legacy braided into strands, a bold proclamation of who he was, what he stood for, and the fierce discipline that made him, for better or worse, a living embodiment of Bushido. Wigs, braids, and topknots might seem like simple hairstyles at first, but in the warrior's world of feudal Japan, a topknot was a crown forged from culture, honor, and unyielding tradition. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, where the cacophony of merchants hawking their wares, orators declaiming from marble steps, and chariots rattling over cobblestones is matched only by the splendor and audacity of the hairstyles crowning the city's elite. It wasn't just about keeping your hair tidy. No, in Rome, hair was a billboard for wealth, power, and social maneuvering, especially for women draped in silk and men plotting their next political gambit. Let's start with the women, because if you thought modern Instagram influencers were all about filters and flawless selfies, wait until you hear about Roman matrons and their coiffures. The wigs they sported were nothing short of architectural marvels. Think of them as the Baroque cathedrals of hair, all spirals, curls, and gravity-defying towers. These weren't simple adornments plucked from a humble bundle of hairstyles, but highly engineered masterpieces, crafted not just for beauty, but to broadcast status far louder than any toga ever could. Roman elite women's wigs were often astonishingly elaborate, composed of carefully arranged curls that could rival a bird's nest after a hurricane or a squirrel's winter stash. Made primarily from the hair of enslaved individuals from regions like Gaul, Germany, or even further afield, these wigs were as much a symbol of conquests as beauty. Wearing these tresses was a display of dominion, literal strands from the conquered woven onto the heads of Rome's finest. Makes one wonder if those enslaved hair donors knew they'd become unwitting fashion icons invading Roman parties centuries later. Moreover, the extravagance of these wigs was not only about who had the most hair, but who had the fluffiest. The more voluminous and intricate, the better. Ladies would pile curls sky high, embellishing them with gold pins, ribbons, or even tiny diadems that caught the sunlight and glanced off marble baths. Imagine a headpiece so large and detailed that it required an entire slave's day just to maintain its perfection. Romans called this style the Titus or Flavian, after emperors whose reigns inspired these towering designs. In a way, these wigs were power plays made tangible, challenging the gods themselves, because no mere mortal can reach such heights without drawing attention. But let's not mistake these wigs for frivolous vanity. They were political statements. Roman women, often barred from holding formal office, wielded influence through their appearance, especially their coiffures, to assert their family's prominence. The more ornate the hair, the louder the message. My clan has wealth. We own land, slaves, political clout. In societies where summoning prestige was a daily task, pulling off such a hairstyle was tantamount to planting a flag on the social landscape. It declared, "Here we are, undeniable and untouchable." The maintenance of these towering wigs, by the way, veered deeply into the realm of high maintenance. They were not just worn, but meticulously cared for with beeswax, scented oils, and sometimes even lead-based powders, because who needs modern hair care toxicity when you can have the real deal? The unfortunate side effect, lead poisoning, wasn't uncommon, adding an ominous layer to the glamour. In a twist of tragic irony, the very symbols of power and beauty could quietly poison their wearers. A reminder that in Rome's elite circles, luxury often came paired with danger. While Roman elite women were busy perfecting their elaborate, sky-scraping wigs, Roman men had their own symbolic hairstyles, and these were no less telling. The hair of Roman men, particularly during the Republic and early Empire periods, was a subtle but potent political language that communicated ideals, beliefs, and loyalties. Unlike the flamboyant coiffures of the ladies, men's hairstyles bore the scars and messages of Rome's turbulent politics, revealing how hair could be as charged as any senatorial speech. Take, for instance, the iconic cropped haircut favored by the Roman Republic's famous generals and statesmen. This short, utilitarian style wasn't just practical for battle. It was a deliberate nod to traditional Roman virtues, discipline, austerity, and the unquestioned authority of the Republic's old guard. Julius Caesar himself sported this modest look, especially later in life, which served as a visual statement of his part in restoring order after the chaos of civil wars. To see a Roman man with shaved, neat hair was to witness a tribute to the Republic's ideals, even as the political ground beneath it was shifting faster than a charioteer on a tight corner. Contrast that with the thick, sometimes unruly mop of hair worn by emperors like Nero or Caligula, whose hairstyles seemed to reflect their erratic political reigns. Their manes were far less concerned with tradition and more with spectacle, mirroring their more flamboyant and controversial leadership styles. Hair, after all, can be a metaphor. Where the Republic's heroes wore discipline on their crowns, the emperor's unkempt locks often suggested chaos, indulgence, or a break from convention. Political messaging wasn't confined to mere length or style either. Hair color became a tool of political identity. Blonde was rare and coveted in Rome, and some elite men chose wigs or dyed their hair to stand out amid the sea of dark-haired Italians. This trend was often linked to Cyrus and the Hellenistic kings, suggesting a more exotic, regal flair, or to distinguish a man as cosmopolitan and well-traveled, rubbing metaphorical elbows with the great powers of the East. The symbolic weight of male hairstyles extended beyond generals and emperors. Senators and political aspirants carefully curated their hair to reflect their positions and ambitions. A well-groomed but restrained haircut hinted at respectability and tradition, while a freer style could suggest radicalism or populist sympathies. Hair became a subtle yet fiercely controlled political costume, part of the theater that was Roman public life. Moreover, while women's wigs screamed status and social drama, male hairstyles quietly broadcasted allegiance and ideological stance. If the Roman Republic had its soldiers and statesmen parading with cropped hair that said, "I am Rome," then the empire had a succession of rulers whose hair sometimes hinted at disruption, decadence, or the desire to remake Rome in their own image. So, when wandering ancient Rome, a passerby could read an entire volume of social history simply by glancing at the hairstyles in the crowd. From the dizzying hair pyramids of elite women, crowns of curls, victory trophies of conquered territories, and badges of familial pride, to the controlled symbolic haircuts are wild manes of powerful men. Every lock spoke the language of ambition and power. Hair was identity, statement, weapon, and warning. In a society obsessed with appearances and rank, where power was won and lost with swords and speeches alike, hair was never just hair. It was headlines, armor, and sometimes poison rolled into one. Roman coiffures, with all their extravagance and symbolism, remind us that in history, even the strands on one's head can weave stories of empires rising and falling. In ancient China, hair wasn't just hair. It was a sacred thread linking the living to the ancestors, a physical legacy passed down through generations. The Confucian worldview, with its deep reverence for family and hierarchy, treated hair with almost religious respect. It wasn't simply about looking good. It was about honoring your lineage, your virtues, and your place in society. Cut the wrong strand or wear the wrong style, and you weren't just risking a bad hair day. You were signaling disrespect to the very foundations of your identity. Imagine this. You're born into a world where your hair is literally considered a divine gift from your parents. It's said that your body, including your hair, is a gift from your father and mother, and to alter it recklessly is to defile that gift, an act bordering on sacrilege. This is why the phrase "shou sheng bu yi," meaning to preserve the body is not easy, was deeply embedded in daily life. The simple act of cutting hair wasn't just a cosmetic choice, it was a moral decision. Fold your scissors twice too many, and suddenly you've questioned your filial piety. So, hair became a canvas on which symbols of virtue, age, social rank, and even marital status were boldly painted. The most iconic style, the topknot, where men and unmarried boys alike would gather their hair neatly atop their head into a coil or knot. For the average person, this wasn't about aesthetics. It was a functional hairstyle. But function soon mingled with symbolism. A topknot subtly shouted, "I am young, I am unmarried, and I am ready to serve my family." But the topknot whispered more than just personal status. It was a marker of transition. When a boy reached adulthood, a ceremony called the Guan Li marked this shift, where the topknot took on the sign of a confident man stepping into society's eyes. Tying up the hair became almost like donning armor, a ritual that transformed a child into a responsible adult, ready to uphold family honor. Women's hairstyles in ancient China were an even more elaborate language of symbols, especially when it came to age and virtue. Unlike many cultures where hair is simply a matter of fashion, Chinese women used hair to communicate their position in life, and adherence to Confucian ideals. A young girl's hair might be left flowing or braided simply, innocent and unburdened. But as she grew older, her hair signaled her journey through time and duty. Married women, for instance, would carefully arrange their hair into buns or more complex knots, often secured by ornate hairpins that were more than just accessories. These pins, sometimes made of jade, gold, or silver, were tiny exams in social stature and virtue. The more exquisite and well-crafted the hairpin, the louder the statement, "This woman is virtuous, respected, and wealthy." Lose your hairpin, and it might not just be a fashion faux pas, but a social embarrassment, tantamount to dropping your dignity in public. For widows, hair could take on a somber tone. Some traditions required widows to unbind their decorative hair and let it hang loose as a symbol of mourning and chastity, a visual emblem of loyalty to their deceased husband. Imagine the societal pressure encoded in strands of hair left deliberately untended, a poignant signal broadcast in the silent language of grooming. There's also the matter of social stratification. Different hair arrangements served as a kind of shorthand for identifying not just gender or marital status, but class. Nobles and scholars might wear elaborate topknots, their precision and adornment speaking to their elite education and refined status. Peasants stuck to simpler styles out of practical necessity, their hair buried under rough hats or left plainly tied to survive manual labor. Hairstyles, in this sense, reinforced the rigid social ladder, making it painfully clear who ruled the Mandarin's council and who tilled the rice fields. And let's not forget the darker side of hair politics, punishments and social shame. A man deemed disloyal or a criminal could face hair shaving as a public mark of disgrace, a personal humiliation akin to having all your followers unsubscribe overnight. The message: you don't just lose your freedom, you lose your face, your honor, and your very selfhood. Hair was power, but lose your hair, and you lost everything. This intricate dance between cultural expectation and personal expression meant that hairstyles were rarely left to chance. Learning to style one's hair wasn't just a matter of vanity, but a necessary education in social survival. It was a skill passed down from mother to daughter, father to son, often accompanied by strict rules and seasonal rituals. Cutting hair during certain times of the lunar calendar was taboo. Grooming was linked to health and spiritual well-being. Mess up your top knot in front of the family elders, and you might as well have announced your impending doom at the dinner table. Perhaps the most telling snippet of this hair-bound morality tale is found in literature and art from the era where sweeping buns and meticulously pinned tresses serve not just as details of costume, but as powerful symbols of character. A woman with loose hair might be portrayed as frivolous or rebellious, while the dignified bun signaled wisdom, restraint, and allegiance to societal expectations. For men, the state of the topknot could reveal a character's moral fiber just as surely as their actions on the battlefield or at the scholar's desk. So when ancient Chinese men and women pulled their hair apart, braided it, or wound it onto their heads, they were participating in a complex system of communication, one that was as much about respect, obedience, and social order as it was about beauty. The humble hairpin, the tight bun, the precise topknot, they were all pieces in a social puzzle that articulated the Confucian virtues of filial piety, loyalty, and propriety without uttering a single word. In a society where a strand of hair could carry the weight of family honor, personal virtue, and societal rank, hairstyles were anything but superficial. They were silent sermons, whispered history, and proud declarations interwoven with every twist and turn. And perhaps in a world obsessed with appearances and social signaling, isn't that a language every era can understand? Imagine the swirling patterns of twisted hair, each strand braided with a purpose as deliberate as a secret handshake or a family crest. In many African societies, braids were far more than just a hairstyle. They were a living, breathing language, spoken through the fingers rather than the voice. To the untrained eye, these were beautiful designs, a dazzling display of artistic dexterity and patience. But beneath those layers of intricate plaits lay messages dense with meaning, markers of identity, status, age, marital availability, and tribal belonging, all woven simultaneously into a coiffure that was as much a personal statement as it was a community emblem. Step back thousands of years, and you'll find evidence of these braided masterpieces etched in the very soil of human history. Archaeologists uncovered 3,000-year-old clay heads from the Nok culture of Nigeria, each crowned with meticulously detailed miniature braided hairstyles that defy simple ornamentation. It's as if ancient sculptors knew that hair, more than just a feature of the face, was the crown jewel of identity, deserving of immortalization. And that attention wasn't limited to stone and clay. In fact, braiding was one of the first, and arguably most sophisticated, forms of self-expression across African cultures. But why braids? Why such laborious and time-consuming artistry, often taking hours or even days? The answer lies in community and continuity. Braiding was, and remains, a social event. Imagine a room buzzing with conversation, the rhythmic clicking of beads weaving through the strands, the feel of gentle fingers coaxing rebellious curls into place, the occasional giggle or proud announcement of a new braiding style chosen for a special occasion. It was here, in this intimate space, that knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Mothers taught daughters, elders mentored youth, alliances were celebrated, and secrets shared. The hairstyle was not just vanity, it was education and connection. In many tribal societies, a braid's pattern could signal complex social information. For example, The Maasai people of Kenya and Tanzania didn't just wear their hair, they communicated with it. The Maasai warriors, young unmarried men, wore their braids long and thin, dyed with red ochre to symbolize vitality and courage. Once a warrior married or passed certain rites of initiation, his hair would change, often shaved or styled differently, marking that transition unmistakably. In some cases, the style became a timeline etched onto the scalp, visually narrating key life milestones. Look deeper into West Africa, and the Yoruba people reveal another fascinating dimension of braiding as cultural code. Specific designs, known as ponmo, conveyed not only ethnic identity, but also family lineage and social rank. The finer the braid, the higher the status. The more elaborate the pattern, the stronger the clan's standing was proclaimed. Beyond aesthetics, this was a way to uphold social order without a word being uttered. It's social networking at its finest, deciphered strand by strand. But it wasn't just about hierarchy or age. Hairstyles were doorways into celebrations, mourning, rebellion, and solace. For instance, in times of mourning, women might wear their hair loose and unbraided, a stark departure from the norm, signaling grief in a culture where community eyes were often watchful. In some tribes, a widow's hair was braided in patterns that reflected her new status, effectively marking her place in society's unwritten rules of sympathy and respect. And let's not overlook the playful defiance embedded in some styles. Among the Ashanti of Ghana, intricate topknots and twisted braids could mock oppressive rulers or serve as subtle acts of resistance. Like coded graffiti on a scalp, these styles whispered dissent in a world where open rebellion might bring harsh punishment. Hair thus became a political statement, a silent protest eerily reminiscent of the modern-day power of a bold haircut or colorful dye in challenging norms. Interestingly, the cultural significance of braids wasn't frozen in time. These styles evolved alongside shifting social landscapes, trade routes, and even colonization. When European explorers first set foot on African coasts, they were baffled, not just by the hairstyles, but by the sheer complexity encoded within them. It was clear that hair was as serious as diplomacy or warfare. Some colonizers, however, sadly failed to recognize this and viewed African braids through a narrow lens of exoticism and savagery, attempting to erase or criminalize these expressions of identity. Resistance took many forms, but holding on to traditional braiding practices was a powerful act of cultural survival. This rich vocabulary of hair also plays a pivotal role in African diasporic communities. Across the Atlantic, enslaved Africans managed to preserve and adapt their intricate braiding traditions within the brutal confines of slavery. Hair braiding sessions on plantations became moments of whispered remembrance, a tether to a fractured past and a bold declaration of humanity in the face of dehumanizing conditions. Some scholars argue that these styles even contained coded maps to safe houses or signals passed among community members, a testament to how hair transcended mere fashion and entered the realm of coded resistance. Even today, the legacy of African braids endures and thrives, not just in Africa, but globally. From hip-hop culture to high-fashion runways, braided hairstyles continue to convey identity, pride, and connection to ancestry. They remind us that hair is never just about looking good. It's about telling a story, claiming a place in the world, and refusing to be silenced. So next time you admire an elaborate braid, consider the layers of history woven into those strands. It's not just a hairstyle, it's a statement, a saga, a living archive kept safe by fingers and time, bridging past and present, individual and community. In the silent eloquence of a braid, an entire heritage speaks. Imagine a language spoken without a single word, where every twist, curl, and braid broadcasts a message as loud as a drum beat or a war cry. Long before the rise of TikTok hair tutorials or the endless scroll of Instagram hair inspo, indigenous peoples across the Americas wielded their hair as a subtle yet powerful code, a living billboard of identity, spirituality, and social standing. This was no mere vanity project. Hair was a symbol wrapped tightly around every strand, finding the sacred, the social, and the martial into one elaborate statement that was every bit as meaningful as painted symbols or ceremonial garments. Take, for instance, the feather-adorned braids of many plains tribes. Each feather a story, a token of honor snatched from the jaws of danger or victory. Imagine warriors weaving eagle feathers into their hair after acts of bravery in battle or through rites of passage. These weren't fashion accessories plucked from some ancient runway. They were badges, trophies literally worn on the head, proclaiming self-identity and communal respect all at once. The length, fullness, and even the direction of braids could shout allegiance to a specific band or kinship group, and sometimes even signal a person's recent exploits or spiritual purity. It was like walking billboards, but ones designed to awe and command rather than annoy. Of course, haircuts played their part just as dramatically. Consider the scalp locks, either shaved or intentionally maintained, worn by some indigenous warriors. In some cultures, shaving one side of the head and leaving a long lock or topknot was a sign of a warrior's readiness for battle, almost like a historical mohawk, minus the punk rock influence, but with double the meaning. This hairstyle was a beacon and a warning. It told potential foes, cross me and you'll face someone with the blessings of ancestors and the courage of a lion. Far from just grooming quirks, These cuts involved ritual and reverence, often accompanied by solemn ceremonies, drumming, and sometimes blood rites. Then there were the more intricate braid patterns that looked like complex road maps. Some tribes believed the braids themselves were pathways connecting an individual to the spiritual world or to tribal ancestors. The arrangement of these braids wasn't random. It was a deliberate act of storytelling, a daily weaving of myth, memory, and present identity. Think of it like an ancient version of a digital signature, but crafted with human hair and a pinch of religious fervor. Failing to maintain or honor these styles could be seen as turning one's back on tradition, or worse, inviting spiritual misfortune. In some communities, changing your hairstyle without permission was tantamount to social suicide, a public declaration of disrespect for the living and the dead alike. But don't picture this as some dusty, distant ritual frozen in time. These hair customs were living, breathing pots of daily life. They functioned as social calendars, spiritual barometers, and battlefield inventories. A young man entering adulthood might grow out his hair to mark his transition from boyhood to warrior status, only to have it cut dramatically during a ritual that symbolized rebirth. Women's hairstyles, too, carried deep significance, often linked to fertility cycles, marital status, or clan rules. The time and skill invested in braiding, decorating, and maintaining these hairstyles often meant that serving as a hairdresser was not a mundane chore, but a role of trust and respect. Feathers weren't the only decorations either. Seashells, beads, animal teeth, and colorful dyes all adorned hair, each element adding layers of meaning. Some dyes were made from crushed minerals, others from plant extracts so potent they could stain hair or skin for weeks, signaling a pilgrim's journey or a hunter's success. The complexity of these adornments was a testament to an individual's life, their family's history, and their standing in the tribe. Forget about a simple Instagram filter. This was social media brought to life, textured with mud, blood, and feathers. And let's not overlook the spiritual dimension. Hair was often seen as an extension of the soul, a direct line to the divine. Letting a lock grow long, or even refraining from cutting hair at certain times, was an act of devotion or mourning. Pulling out hair as a sign of grief was common, turning this physical part of the body into a canvas of raw human emotion. That hair, when cut or lost, was sometimes collected and buried or preserved because it was believed to retain a piece of the person's spirit. To cut off a warrior's hair against their will or desecrate these sacred braids was deeply taboo, and in some cases, a declaration of hostility. Even in times of conflict, hairstyles were never abandoned. Instead, they adapted. For warriors going off to battle, their hair was often braided tightly or bound up, both for practical reasons and to channel spiritual protection. The act of tightening a braid could invoke strength and focus, almost like a psychological armor. Some warriors adorned their hair with small charms or amulets, believed to ward off injury or death. So, in a very real sense, hair became armor, not just physical, but metaphysical as well. If there's a single lesson to be drawn from this holistic view of indigenous hair traditions, it's this. Hair was far, far more than a personal aesthetic choice. It was a living script, a cultural billboard, a spiritual talisman, and a battlefield standard rolled into one. The strands weaving through the scalps of ancient America weren't just strands of keratin. They were threads in a complex tapestry of meaning, worn with pride and ritualized care, speaking volumes without uttering a single word. Next time you glance at a picture of a feathered braid or a high topknot in indigenous artwork, remember, it's not just hair, it's history, identity, and meaning, all tangled up in the most human of treats. Ah, ancient Greece, the land of philosophers, democracy, and, as you might not immediately guess, obsessively significant hairstyles. If you imagine Greeks rocking messy buns or just throwing their hair into a simple knot before marching off to debate Plato and Aristotle, think again. Their hairstyling was anything but casual. It was a complex, coded language woven into every curl, braid, and coil. What we might dismiss today as a mere fashion choice was actually dripping with symbolism and social meaning. Take the braided crown, for example. It wasn't just about looking regal or channeling your inner goddess. No, these intricate plaits carried weighty messages about citizenship, virtue, and divine favor. The braided crown, a circle of carefully intertwined strands, acted like a wearable emblem of status and propriety. Women who wore these styles weren't merely focused on aesthetics. They were announcing their role in society and their alignment with sacred ideals. And men, they weren't left out of the hairstyling game either. Their styles broadcasted similar signals, often reflecting military status or philosophical rigor. Now, you might picture the Greek gods as perpetually clean-cut and perfectly coiffed, but their mythologies included enough hairstyling quirks to fill a salon manual for deities. Hairstyles in myth weren't just decorative. They were narrative devices symbolizing power, tragedy, or transformation. Take Medusa. Her hair wasn't just unruly, it was a literal weapon, a writhing nest of venomous snakes that turned onlookers to stone. Snakes on your head, definitely a fashion statement that scares off more than just bad hair days. Even the divine meddling in hairstyles extended to social mythology. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, was often portrayed with a flawless hairdo that represented clarity, intelligence, and strategic prowess. Her iconic helmet sat atop those carefully arranged curls, enhancing that deadly combination of brain and brawn. Meanwhile, Aphrodite's flowing locks symbolized irresistible beauty and erotic power, the ancient equivalent of perfect Instagram hair. making everyone double tap. If only they had Instagram back then. Such mythological underpinnings weren't merely fanciful. They shaped real social narratives. Citizens were expected to model their hairstyles on these divine examples, using their hair as a living homage to the gods. A well-arranged coiffure was akin to wearing one's civic badge. Mess it up, and you might just throw your social standing into jeopardy. The styling itself required time and skill that should not be underestimated. Greek hairstyling was often a performance, an art form practiced by specialized hairdressers who could manipulate thick, unruly Mediterranean hair into sculptural masterpieces. These experts knew how to coax tight curls into lavish arrangements, or braid strands into complex wreaths that could rival any modern crown jewels. Getting your hair done wasn't a quick pit stop, it was an event, part ritual, part social theater. But let's not imagine that all this fuss was universally embraced. There was an undercurrent of cultural tension about who was allowed to carry these hairstyles. The braided crown, for instance, was predominantly a female domain, but with heavy restrictions. Unmarried women sometimes wore simpler styles, symbolizing their availability or transition into adulthood, while married women flaunted the elaborate crowns to signal their respectable status. Men's hairstyles, often shorter and more restrained, signaled maturity and participation in public life. Hair, in this sense, acted very much like a scroll unfurled for all to read. Here's who I am, where I stand, and what ideals I embody. Let's not forget the tricky politics of appearance in a culture obsessed with civic honor and reputation. A careless hairdo was not just a faux pas, it could hint at moral weakness, lack of discipline, or even social rebellion. There are accounts of Athenian women who faced public criticism, or worse, for failing to maintain the visual standards expected of them. That's right, your hairstyle could get you into hot water. The stakes were high when your coiffure was a speaking part in the grand civic drama. Moreover, hairstyles oscillated between the practical and the symbolic during various festivals and rituals. For instance, before sacred ceremonies, participants might untangle or even cut their hair to symbolize purification, sacrifice, or renewal. This act of modifying hair wasn't mere vanity, it was steeped in spiritual significance. Hair was not just part of the body, but a channel for divine connection. Changing the way it was styled could alter one's relationship to the gods, a personal yet public transformation made visible to all. And then there's the darker side of hair symbolism, where styles could also communicate power and intimidation. Think of warriors with fierce topknots or elaborate braids. designed not only for battlefield practicality, but to dazzle and unsettle opponents. Hair became a kind of armor, a psychological weapon, or a way to mark membership in elite circles. The Spartans, ever the utilitarians, kept hairstyles more practical, yet still imbued them with meaning, because even in a society dedicated to austerity, hair was never just on the surface. Connecting all these threads, quite literally, is the idea that hair in ancient Greece was a living, breathing language. It was never static or shallow. Through its styles, Greeks told stories about themselves, about their gods, and about the social and moral order they inhabited. Braids represented unity and continuity. Curls could denote wealth or wideness. The topknot could be a badge of honor or a religious statement. Imagine walking through an ancient Athenian agora, surrounded by a rainbow of coiffures, each one a silent but eloquent storyteller. Each style carried echoes of mythic adventure, societal structure, and deeply held beliefs. Hairstyles weren't merely about aesthetics. They were a mirror held up to the values, anxieties, and aspirations of an entire civilization. So next time you think about ancient Greek culture, don't just picture philosophers squabbling or athletes competing. Think of the elaborate sprays of curls and braids that crowned their heads. Those hairstyles were more than pretty. They were a vital, vibrant script, a symbolic language written with hair, telling stories of beauty, power, identity, and the divine. In a way, the ancient Greeks were the original influencers, crafting trends that spoke volumes long before hashtags and selfies came along. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of an ancient Indian city where every head turning isn't just a fashion statement, but a living emblem of the cosmos, society, and spiritual aspiration, all rolled into one dangled, braided, or neatly coiled masterpiece. Hair in ancient India wasn't merely about style. It was a code, a language whispered through strands and knots, readable to anyone who knew where to look. Those sacred top knots, those elaborate braids, and the meticulously maintained locks all spoke of something beyond vanity. They declared who you were, what you believed, your social rank, and yes, even your marital status. Because let's face it, nothing says, "I'm married," like a hairstyle that screams it from the rooftop. Take the ascetics first. Those enigmatic figures who seem to have taken the phrase "bad hair day" to a whole new spiritual level. Their hair told tales of detachment from worldly desires. The sacred topknot or shikha, perched like a stubborn tuft, defying gravity, wasn't just a quirky fashion choice. It was a visual testament to purity and devotion, a physical symbol of their connection to the divine and their rejection of the mundane. The rest of the hair was often shaved away, almost as if to say, "Look, I've stripped off all earthly distractions, focusing my soul instead of my scalp." It might sound extreme, because it was, but In a culture where the sacred and the everyday danced so closely, these hairstyles served as spiritual badges of honor. Imagine the audacity of wearing a patch of hair like a lone beacon of sanctity in a bald expanse, daring the world to question your spiritual status. Now, swing open the doors of royal palaces, and suddenly, hair becomes a dazzling spectacle. Ornamental braids weren't just about keeping hair out of the face while attending to empire building. No, they were deliberate displays of wealth, power, and aesthetic sophistication. The royal women's braids were often thick, glossy rivers of hair intertwined with pearls, gold threads, and fragrant flowers, each decoration meticulously chosen for symbolic meaning. A braid was not simply a hairstyle, it was a carefully crafted narrative, braid, if you will, weaving tales of lineage, allegiance, and status. If an ancient Indian noblewoman's hair caught your eye with its intricate artistry, you weren't just witnessing beauty, you were witnessing a storytelling device of hereditary pride and social hierarchy. In a society where caste and class dominated daily life, these ornamental braids broadcasted a woman's elevated station as clearly as a crown or a scepter. And what about caste? You might think your hair today is only a representation of style or hygiene, but back then, the hairstyle you donned could immediately lock you into a social bracket tighter than any written law. Brahmins, the priestly caste, often sported the shika topknot, as we mentioned, a badge of their ritual purity and learning, instantly marking them as spiritual guides and holders of sacred knowledge. The Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, had their own distinct styles, often favoring loose flowing hair or specific bejeweled hairpieces that signified valor and nobility. Meanwhile, the Vaishyas and Shudras adopted simpler hairdos, underscoring their roles as merchants, farmers, and laborers. In this way, hair was less about individual preference and more about social identity imposed from birth, a biological billboard stamped in follicles. But here's the twist. Marital status and family expectations often intertwined with these caste and spiritual hair codes, weaving an even more complicated hairstyle tapestry. A married woman's hair was a calendar of her life's milestones. Married women would tie their hair up in a bun, called the knot of fidelity, or braid it with styles that symbolized their commitment and responsibilities. Widows, on the other hand, might be expected to shave their heads completely, or at least drastically simplify their hairstyles to indicate their changed social standing and spiritual state. Imagine that. One day, your hair might represent the bloom of womanhood, and the next, its absence screamed your loss loud and clear. No pressure on a hair appointment to get this right. Your scalp was a social document everyone read. Handling all these symbolic hairstyles must have been a full-time occupation. There were rituals for hair washing and anointing, special combs carved from ivory or sandalwood imbued with spiritual significance, and countless stories spun around hair care itself. Hair was also a canvas for cultural expression. scented with jasmine and sandalwood, decorated for festivals, styled differently across seasons and celestial events. It was as much a part of religious ceremonies as fire or water, linking the physical body to the spiritual world through threads of hair. So the next time you glance in the mirror and wonder whether that messy bun or that latest haircut means something, consider this. Ancient Indian hairstyles weren't just about looking good or keeping trendy. They were profound, symbolic statements, coded messages sent out that declared everything from purity and devotion to power and rank, and the deeply personal journeys of marriage and family life. Each twist and coil was a word in a larger cultural language that tied the wearer to the cosmos, society, and the divine. Hair was not just hair, it was a living text, worn every day by millions, telling stories more vivid than any scrolls or inscriptions. In a world where your social identity was woven into your very scalp, grooming wasn't vanity, it was survival. And yes, before you ask, a bad hair day could mean a bad social day. So those ancient braids, topknots, and hair rituals, they weren't just hairstyles. They were codes for navigating life's intricate dance between the earthly and the divine. And really, that might be the oldest hairstyle advice of all. Your hair isn't just on your head. It's on stage, in history, and very much part of your story. Imagine a Viking warrior striding into battle, the wind tugging at his hair as the clash of steel and the roar of men fill the air. His hair isn't just a wild tangle of locks. It's a carefully curated badge of honor, a living banner screaming, "I am fierce, I belong, and I fear nothing." Viking hairstyles weren't mere fashion statements. They were powerful symbols, woven into the very fabric of identity, hierarchy, and reputation. Start with the braids, those rugged, purposeful twists of hair that could easily be mistaken for the handiwork of a hairstylist obsessed with action films. Vikings often braided their hair to keep it out of their faces while battling, but these weren't just practical knots. Each braid told a story. Thick, intricate braids signaled experience and battle readiness, like battle scars told in strands of hair. The more elaborate the braid, the more seasoned or terrifying the warrior. Why braids, you ask? Well, in a time without helmets designed for comfort, hair that stayed put was a tactical advantage. But beyond functionality, braids conveyed rank and accomplishment. Some were triple braided, some wrapped with leather strips, and others even adorned with beads or bits of metal, trophies taken from fallen enemies or gifted by chieftains. Imagine a Viking showing up to a feast, flaunting braids embedded with silver beads snatched from a rival clan. It's like Instagram flexing, but with more blood and fewer filters. Then there were the shaved patterns. Nothing says, "I'm not just a fighter, I'm a statement," quite like partially shaved heads. Vikings didn't always keep their hair uniformly long. Shaved sides, closely cropped around the temples, often accompanied fierce topknots or long hair at the back, a haircut that screams, "Don't mess with me," but also, "I have an eye for style." These shaved designs weren't random. They could signify clan allegiance or personal achievements, almost like heraldic banners etched in skin and hair. Some even integrated intricate patterns that looked like ancient runes, mythical beasts, or zigzag lines meant to intimidate opponents. And trust me, nothing puts the fear of Odin into someone like a few twisted runes etched into a warrior's scalp. Speaking of topknots, these were no mere afterthoughts. The topknot was the Vikings' version of the modern man bun, but with more brutality and far less yoga studio vibe. Tying their hair into a knot at the crown wasn't just for keeping hair tidy, it was a symbol of martial prowess and unwavering resolve. The topknot acted like a visual exclamation point on their intimidating presence. It said, "I am ready for battle, and I am not here to make friends." Sometimes the topknot would be paired with loose braids dangling down the back, an intentional contrast that balanced order and wildness. Hair in Viking culture was also an indicator of social standing. The king's sons wouldn't be caught dead with unkempt hair, lest they undermine their claim to power. Nor would respected warriors. For them, hair care was a serious business, involving combs usually crafted from bone or antler, painstakingly carved and sometimes decorated with ornate patterns. Combed hair was a mark of discipline, a hint that beneath that rough exterior existed a well-ordered mind and a reliable sword arm. In a world where social hierarchy was largely enforced through display and reputation, hair was yet another battlefield where status was won and lost. Clan allegiance could be read through hair as well. Different clans might adopt specific hairstyles or braiding techniques that functioned almost like a secret handshake. Spotting the braid pattern could mean the difference between slaying a friend or foe on the battlefield, or knowing where your loyalties lay in a complex web of rivalries. Sometimes the choice of hairstyle could even act as a code during raids, identifying who belonged where without uttering a single word. Imagine a chaotic raid scene where warriors are flashing blade and braids both, their hairstyles a whispered language of blood and trust. But Vikings also knew that hair could enhance their fierce reputations, raising their status not just in battle, but in legend. Hair had magical and religious undertones. Some believed long hair held strength, drawn from the gods themselves, an idea seen in the Norse myths, where strength, vigor, and divine favor often linked to physical appearance. Shaving one's hair too hastily or negligently could be considered dishonorable, a sign of disrespect to both the individual's ancestors and the gods. Conversely, a warrior who emerged from battle with hair intact and lavishly braided could be seen as favored by the gods, a man under Odin's protection. One cannot overlook the battle-ready practicality either. What use is fine hair if it's tangled, offering your enemy an easy grip? Viking warriors took pride in grooming themselves before combat, and that pride was not vanity, it was tactical precision, bundled in cultural meaning. Imagine a head of hair tangled and wild versus a streamlined braid or a fierce topknot. Which seems more intimidating? The answer is obvious. Careful grooming was a prerequisite for commanding fear and respect. In some sagas, Vikings used hair rituals to mark transitions, coming-of-age ceremonies, post-battle celebrations, or even mourning rites. Haircuts, braiding, and shaving patterns marked not just who a warrior was, but who he was becoming. Hair wasn't static, it was a living canvas, constantly reshaped to reflect honor earned and battles fought. Looking beyond the battlefields, Viking warriors and chieftains were early masters of personal branding through hair. Each braid, each shave was like a medieval tweet, carefully crafted to broadcast messages of power, loyalty, and identity across clan lines and into the stories that shaped generations. Hair wasn't just hair, it was part of the Vikings' heroic swagger, a fierce declaration that could make even the most hardened foe think twice before striking. So next time you catch a glance of a Viking in a movie or on a History Channel, don't just admire the beard or the axe. Look, really look at the hair. Those braids and topknots aren't just stylistic flair, they're threads of fierce symbolism, woven from bravery, status, allegiance, and that primal quest to be remembered. Because in the world of Vikings, hair wasn't just hair, it was a weapon, a symbol, and sometimes the difference between glory and death. Imagine hair not just as a personal style choice, but as a sacred badge, a living emblem radiating spiritual power, social rank, or divine favor. In many ancient societies, hairstyles weren't mere fashion statements. They were a language written strand by strand, signaling everything from one's role within the cosmos to the invisible boundaries between mortal man and the gods. This wasn't about looking good for a selfie. It was about embodying the sacred. Take the priests and shamans of ancient cultures, for instance. Their hair was often a carefully guarded secret, clipped, braided, or shorn to exact specifications dictated by ritual codes older than written history. Some believed the hair itself held a person's spirit, or even served as a conduit for divine energy. Cutting or styling it wasn't just mundane grooming, but an act of communion or transformation. An ordinary haircut, try soul surgery. In ancient Egypt, the hairstyle of a sacred man could instantly declare his proximity to the divine, his chamber of secrets, or the weight of his spiritual authority. Boy priests often shaved their heads, save for a long lock of braided hair called the sidelock of youth, a curious tuft that hung defiantly by the ear. This odd little hair choice wasn't a throwback to the latest pharaoh-approved trend. It was a visible sign that the boy belonged to the god Horus, sworn into religious service. This sidelock was a lifeline, a marker that he was under divine protection and destined for sacred duties. No casual salon visit here, just a ritual binding of identity and power. Meanwhile, the high priests here adorned themselves with wigs that mimicked the intricate styles favored by their deities. It was as if the wig itself transformed them into walking temples. These were not fluffy, lounging around the house wigs, but hefty, layered masterpieces, stiff with resin and adorned with gold and beads. Wearing such a wig was no small matter. It meant physically embodying the god's presence. Imagine strutting into a temple with a headpiece so heavy it essentially screamed, "Yes, I am the voice of Amun-Re today." The hair was a holy crown, the ultimate religious uniform. Hop over to the ancient Celts, and you'll find another dramatic example of hair as spiritual armor. Druids, the mysterious philosopher priests, are often rumored to have sported long, wild manes, hair-grown, untamed, to mirror their deep connection to nature's raw forces. This wasn't mere stylistic neglect, but a form of symbolic embodiment. The tangled locks represented the chaos of the natural world, which they sought to understand and harness. There are stories, some probably exaggerated, of druids using hair as magical tools. The longer the hair, the greater their mystical strength. It's almost like the ultimate KPIs for witchcraft. Picture a druid striding into a forest with hair streaming in the wind, their unkempt mane a visual spell that commanded both fear and reverence. Similarly, among the shamans of Siberia and Northeast Asia, hair wasn't merely long or short. It was a map of their spiritual journeys. These holy men often grew incredibly long hair, only cutting it during significant ceremonies or rites of passage, such as shamanic initiations. The sacred snip marked a rebirth, a crossing from one realm of understanding into another. To the untrained eye, it might look like a haircut. To the initiated, it was the severing of one world's ties to fully embrace the next. And if you thought your last bad haircut was dramatic, try the pressure of that moment. On the other hand, some religious traditions valorize the act of complete hair removal as a symbol of purity and devotion. Buddhist monks famously shave their heads, stripping away vanity and worldly attachments like a visual mic drop to ego. But this baldness carries more than aesthetic function. It's a spiritual clean slate, a commitment to humility and the shedding of past selves. Think of it as the ultimate no-hassle hairstyle. Who needs hair when enlightenment is your real glow-up? Perhaps nowhere was hair's sacred symbolism more literal than in the biblical story of Samson. His legendary long locks were the ultimate power source. Cut them, and he was as good as dead, stripped of strength and divine favor. Samson's hair was a metaphor for the embodiment of divine strength itself. His downfall, caused by a haircut, is one of the clearest ancient warnings about the perils and powers entangled in hair rituals. It's the granddaddy of all bad hair day stories, except with much higher stakes. In Hindu culture, certain priests and ascetics wore their hair in distinctive topknots or dreadlocks, called jatha, which symbolized spiritual power and renunciation from worldly desires. Shiva, the god of destruction and transformation, is famously depicted with matted hair piled atop his head, often entwined with sacred rivers and serpents, a living cathedral on his scalp. Emulating this hairstyle wasn't just cosplay, it was a form of devotion, a way to physically manifest the divine energy within. The tangle was Oda, a paradoxical knot of chaos and control, a tangible symbol of cosmic balance that priests and holy men aspired to channel. Even in Japan, the topknot, or chanmage, worn by samurai, had its roots beyond mere status or fashion. It symbolized honor, discipline, and a dedicated warrior's path. The samurai's hair was shaped with such precision, it could be seen as a form of daily meditation, a ritual preparation for battle that fused the physical and spiritual selves into a seamless whole. To cut the topknot was both a practical action and a spiritual death sentence, signaling disgrace or retirement. The hair was a warrior's soul on display. Throughout these varied cultures, the underlying thread is clear. Hair was much more than dead protein. It was a canvas for identity, a battleground for spiritual power, and a living language of sacred communication. Hairstyles served as living altars, visible expressions of invisible worlds and unseen powers. They marked rites of passage, declared allegiances to gods or nature, and forged identities that transcended mere flesh. So next time you flick your hair or try a new style, remember that in ancient times, every strand could carry the weight of the cosmos, and a slip of the scissors might just cost you your spiritual mojo. Hair was power, protection, and prophecy, wrapped up in follicles. Sacred or profane, it was a crown you never quite took off. Imagine a world where your hairstyle wasn't just a matter of vanity or fashion, but a loud and unmissable billboard screaming your place in society. In ancient times, hair was a powerful, nonverbal manifesto of who you were supposed to be, especially when it came to gender. Hair didn't merely sit atop your head. It was a coded language of rules and resistance, defining what men and women could or could not be in the eyes of their communities. If you thought today's hair debates were intense, wait until you meet their ancient ancestors locking horns over legitimacy, power, and identity, one braid or shave at a time. Take the long, intricately braided locks of women in many ancient civilizations. Far from being just a flourish of beauty, these braids were wrapped in layers of symbolism. In ancient Greece, for example, a woman's hair was a visible barometer of her social and marital status. Maidens typically wore their hair long and braided, a testament to their unmarried status and perhaps a subtle nod to their availability and virtue. The braids weren't mere idle embellishments. They were statements loud enough to shout, "I am maidenly, modest, but ready for my life's chapter to begin." Married women, on the other hand, often wore their hair up or covered it with veils, essentially signaling hands off through a hairstyle. The social code was clear. Hair was the gendered badge differentiating available from taken, young from old, maiden from matron. Now, drill deeper into the societies like ancient Egypt or China, where women's hairstyles became even more elaborate and gender-defined. Egyptian women adorning their heads with long braided hair or wigs weren't just following a fashion trend. They were literally wearing their status and femininity like a crown. Hair was so tied to identity that cutting a woman's hair could be the ultimate humiliation, tantamount to stripping her of her womanhood. On the flip side, Egyptian men, particularly the elite, often wore shaved heads while reserving ornate wigs for ceremonial occasions, a stark gendered contrast between bare practicality and ornate display. This mirrored an unyielding dichotomy: rugged masculinity versus cultivated femininity, reinforced by how much or how little hair you sported. But here's where things get spicy. Hair wasn't always a force of conformity. It could also be a tool to subtly, or not so subtly, challenge gender norms. In certain Native American tribes, for instance, gender wasn't a strict binary neatly sealed with braids or shaved crowns. Instead, hair was a battleground for expressing more fluid or expanded gender identities. Two-spirit individuals often combined elements of traditionally masculine and feminine hairstyles in their appearance, deliberately blending or transcending expectations. The long braid could intermingle with shaved patches, signaling a personal or spiritual refusal to be boxed in by the gender norms of the dominant society. Hair was a form of rebellion, resistance, and identity, all rolled into one tightly woven strand. Consider also the strict rules imposed on male hairstyles within the caste systems of ancient India. Brahmins, the priestly class, were often required to maintain a specific hair tuft called the shikha at the crown of the head, while the rest was shaved. This tiny patch was a potent, sacred symbol that reinforced their caste and religious rule. It wasn't just style, it was a physical, visual pledge embedded in the scalp. Men in lower castes or different social strata were denied such hairstyles, underscoring how hair demarcated social and often spiritual hierarchies with unflinching precision. Would you dare cut that tuft? That was more than a bad haircut. It was sacrilege and social sabotage. The topknot, a hairstyle notoriously worn by samurai in feudal Japan, provides another fascinating glimpse into how hair could propel or police gender and class expectations. The chanmage, as it was known, functioned beyond mere convenience to keep helmets snug in battle. It was a clear commander's badge and a symbol of honor and masculinity. Samurai men grew and maintained this carefully tied knot, while commoners either couldn't or wouldn't adopt it without severe social repercussions. To shave it off was to invite dishonor, defeat, and sometimes death. The warrior's topknot was the haircut equivalent of a royal seal that told peasants and nobility alike, this man belongs to the honorable warrior class, and, by extension, embodies the ideal male virtues of discipline, loyalty, and strength. A man without his topknot was a man stripped of his very essence. Meanwhile, women faced an almost inverse policing of their hair. In ancient Rome, for example, the more complex and towering a woman's hairstyle, the more it displayed her wealth, leisure, and traditional female virtue. A complicated coiffure was less about glorifying individual beauty and more about performing femininity and social standing, a public spectacle of what a respectable Roman matron ought to look like. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was an enforced performance, often involving slaves or servants to sculpt those gravity-defying curls, and curls within curls, hour upon hour. The gender framework here was crystal clear. Men with simple, practical haircuts for public duty and battle. Women with elaborate, high-maintenance hair as a public display of domestic success and social order. The hairdresser was as much an enforcer of gender roles as any magistrate. Yet, not all men were sporting cropped or shaved heads in defiance or conformity. Some ancient cultures celebrated male long hair, privileging it as a symbol of virility and spiritual potency. The Scythians, nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppes, grew their hair long and braided, sometimes weaving in gold and beads. This wasn't just for show, it marked warrior status and tribal allegiance. And yet, while society granted men this luxurious freedom, it was simultaneously wielded as a marker of difference. The man who shaved his head betrayed not just fashion sense, but allegiance to a different class or function. In some cases, criminal classes or slaves had their heads shaved forcibly, a brutal branding of social inferiority and emasculation without saying a word aloud. All of these examples converge to reveal one essential truth. Ancient hairstyles were loaded with far more meaning than mere ornamentation. They etched the boundaries of gender, status, and identity with a razor-sharp cultural precision. Hair could reinforce the dominant gender order by signaling who was allowed to be this, who must be that. But it was also a space of contestation where individuals and groups could assert different identities, sometimes challenging or subverting official norms. A hair braid might be a daily act of conformity by one, and a radical act of defiance by another. So when next you run your fingertips through your hair or grumble over a bad cut, remember, in ancient societies, the strands atop your head weren't just about style, but survival, power, and identity. A haircut wasn't just a haircut, it was a loaded narrative, told strand by strand, braid by braid, a persistent declaration of who you were allowed to be, and, just as importantly, who you weren't. Imagine stepping into the blistering sun of ancient Egypt, where the relentless heat not only baked the land, but also threatened anyone's scalp with an unforgiving blaze. In this world, Hair wasn't just a matter of vanity. It was a survival tool draped in symbolism. And here, wigs first made their grand entrance, not as frivolous accessories, but serious, practical inventions born of necessity. Long before Hollywood red carpets ever heard of hair extensions, the Egyptians were pioneering wigs with an eye both on style and substance. The desert's scorching sun and biting sandstorms made keeping one's own hair intact a challenge. Men and women shaved their heads almost entirely, a move that sounds extreme today, but was actually quite sensible when you consider the risks of lice and the sun's brutal glare. But bare scalp came with its own problems, primarily vulnerability to the elements and societal perceptions. Enter the wig, carefully crafted from human hair, wool, or vegetable fibers. It was a literal and figurative crown. These hairpieces weren't just slapped on haphazardly. They were elaborate constructions, meticulously styled into braids, curls, and layers that communicated status as loudly as a golden necklace or a jeweled collar. The wigs were often blackened with resin or dyed dark to mimic the coveted shiny locks of youth and vitality. They offered shade, protection, and a stage for expressing identity, a practical solution that turned into a social art form. But wigs in ancient Egypt went beyond the everyday wearer's needs. Pharaohs and priests used them to cement their authority. Wearing a wig was almost a ritual act. The hairpiece was a symbol of divine power, connecting mortals with gods. If Cleopatra's famous charisma sprang from her wit and political cunning, her carefully styled wigs likely added a visual punch to her enigmatic allure. Moving across the Mediterranean to ancient Rome, wigs took on a slightly different flavor, though the core idea of practicality mixed with status signaling remained. Here, the Roman elite, especially women, embraced wigs to mask baldness, a condition not necessarily confined to the weather or lice, but often fueled by age, stress, and the rigorous realities of Roman life. But wigs in Rome also jumped into the realm of theatrical drama, quite literally. Roman actors wore wigs to transform into characters, blurring the lines between identity and performance. The Romans were obsessed with appearance, not much different from our modern celebrity culture, though with a good deal more hair powder. Wigs became tools of social mobility and empire-wide trends. Blonde wigs, made from imported European hair, were especially prized by Roman matrons, craving the exotic allure of northern beauty. This obsession with foreign hair highlights something both amusing and sad. Even nearly 2,000 years ago, the grass was greener, or at least the hair was blonder, on the other side of the empire. Yet not everyone was a fan. Satirists of the time poked fun at the over-the-top wig-wearing aristocracy, likening their poofy, color-enhanced hairstyles to birds' nests or cotton candy. It was the original ancient hair goals versus hair fails debate played out in public squares rather than on Instagram. As centuries marched forward, the idea of the wig spread and evolved into new cultures and contexts. In the Byzantine Empire, wigs were valuable commodities enjoyed by the elite while continuing that delicate balance between necessity and ostentation. They shielded baldness, masked illness, and projected power. Imagine the mental image of a Byzantine noble slipping on a wig crafted with painstaking precision, knowing that atop this artificial glory rested their entire public image. By the time Europe entered the medieval and Renaissance periods, wigs expanded their symbolic reach. They were no longer only practical, but increasingly extravagant. Nobles used them as a form of armor, projecting authority and status in courts where appearance literally determined your survival and influence. Consider Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose voluminous powdered wigs became legendary symbols of royal grandeur, and also epic breeding grounds for lice, a problem often left unmentioned in official portraits. Wigs became political statements, cultural markers, and even tools in gender play. They were powerful social signifiers that spoke without words. Look at me. I have wealth. I command respect. And I don't really have to lift a finger because my hair does the talking. Yet, underneath all that grandeur lay the undeniable pragmatism of wigs as protection against climate, cleanliness, and, as history rarely acknowledges, discomfort. This duality, the interplay of utility and extravagance, is what makes the story of wigs so fascinating. They mirror humanity's constant negotiation between survival and self-expression. In scorching deserts, freezing palaces, bustling cities, and court intrigue, they whispered secrets about who wore them, why, and what messages were silently broadcast with every carefully arranged curl, braid, or topknot. So, while today we may see wigs as fun parties or theatrical props, for much of human history, they were vital cultural artifacts navigating the messy, complicated dance between biology, environment, and society. From shielding Egyptian priests from sunstroke, to marking Roman matrons with imported blonde locks, to crowning European kings with powdery halos of power, wigs carried stories of ambition, survival, and identity woven tightly into every strand. And sometimes, just sometimes, they were the ultimate hair flip in history. Imagine sitting in a bustling ancient marketplace, the air thick with the scent of herbs, oils, and the sharp tang of heated metal. Around you, people from all walks of life carve out their daily routines, but among them, a particular figure moves with a practiced grace, a skilled artisan wielding tools that are part comb, part weapon, part secret to social survival. Meet the hairdresser of antiquity, the unsung master behind every twist, braid, and towering topknot. These craftsmen and women weren't just styling for vanity. They were shaping status, identity, and sometimes even the fate of their clients. Let's be honest, If you think curling irons and pomade are modern inventions, think again. Ancient hairdressers operated with a kit as sophisticated as today's high-end salons, except their blow dryers were probably just the breeze, and their products, well, often a mix of crushed herbs, animal fats, and, let's say, not so pleasant smelling concoctions. But that mattered little. What counted was the artistry and precision that went into every lock. Take ancient Egypt, for example, where hair was almost a sacred realm. The art of hairstyling was monopolized by dedicated artisans who wielded bronze combs, tiny knives, and intricate tools fashioned with care. These combs weren't mere detangling devices. They were status symbols, often decorated with precious metals or inlaid stones. Their owners were the first influencers, and their salons, think of them as early-day beauty parlors, characteristically open-air but buzzing with activity. But how did these specialists acquire their skills? Apprenticeships, mentorships, and a whole lot of practice, sometimes starting in adolescence. These were not just barbers cutting hair, they were cultural interpreters. A simple braid could denote marital status, tribal allegiance, or even profession. So the stakes were high. A single misplaced strand could lead to social faux pas, or worse, accusations of rebellion or witchcraft, depending on the era. And hair care wasn't a simple shampoo, rinse, repeat affair either. Depending on region and class, it could involve sophisticated techniques, including steam treatments using heated stones, the application of scented oils that might double as insect repellents, and even elaborate rituals. Picture this: hairdressers rubbing fragrant resin onto hair, sealing it with gentle heat, creating styles that lasted for days without the luxury of modern hairsprays. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about longevity and durability in a world where daily washing was a rarity. In ancient Rome, the hairdresser, or tonsure as they called them, held a surprisingly influential position. They didn't just cut and style hair, they were often confidants, gossip hubs, and occasionally accomplices in political scheming. Imagine a Roman senator walking into a barber shop, and there he finds his stylist calmly discussing the latest conspiracy over a razor shave. Hair, it turns out, was political currency. The elaborate hairstyles of the imperial elite were achieved through enormous effort and the help of multiple stylists working in tandem, wielding curling irons heated on charcoal braziers, pads soaked in perfumes, and an army of pins unparalleled even in today's red carpet events. You thought getting ready for the Oscars was tough. Try spending hours just to get the right Roman nodus without a single hair out of place. Across the vast expanse of Asia, hairstylists combined practical knowledge with spiritual dimensions. In ancient China, hair was considered an extension of one's vitality. Hairdressers didn't just style, they acted as custodians of their client's essence. Using jade combs, thought to promote health, they masterfully crafted topknots and intricate braids that adhered to Confucian ideals of modesty and family hierarchy. There's an irony here. While modern hairstylists endure small talk and awkward silences, these ancient artisans were literally entwining philosophy, social order, and family honor into the strands they manipulated. Tools were at the heart of their craft, of course. Most common was the comb, but not your average plastic number. Materials ranged from carved bone and tortoiseshell to polished wood, each tool suited for specific hair types and styles. The sharp knives and small scissors used demanded killer precision. One slip, and you're looking at an unplanned haircut that could spell social disaster. Heated tongues, surprisingly similar to today's curling irons, were employed to define curls or waves, but they required a careful hand. Too hot and the hair burned, too cold and the style wouldn't hold. Then there were the pins and adornments, everything from feathers and beads to gold plugs and precious stones, all signaling social rank and wealth, or carrying spiritual significance. Hairdressers were sometimes responsible for sourcing these decorations, turning them into wearable art that communicated unspoken messages. It was a blend of craftsmanship and psychological insight. Every ornament, every twist had meaning. Of course, the socially elevated status of hair specialists could vary dramatically. Some were revered, others relegated to the fringes. In many societies, the ability to touch hair was a double-edged sword, since hair was often believed to contain personal or spiritual power. Hairdressers could be trusted advisors or feared figures. They played a strange role, both intimate and exposed, privy to secrets, while wielding scissors that could metaphorically and literally change lives. Consider also the incredible stamina required. Hairstyles like the Indebele's intricate bead-encrusted braids, or the towering powdered wigs of Europe's aristocrats, weren't created in 5-minute Snapchat stories. Some sessions lasted hours, even days, with clients seated patiently or reluctantly through endless teasing, braiding, and pinning. An ancient hairstylist's patience rivaled that of a Zen monk, their hands forming an extension of their artistic vision, coaxing rebellious strands into conformity. The connection between hair and social structure is endlessly fascinating. In some cultures, hairstylists were gatekeepers of transition rites, the haircut marking puberty, marriage, or mourning. When a young man's hair was cut for the first time, or a widow shorn her hair in grief, these actions were carefully orchestrated by hair experts who ensured the ritual's symbolism was perfectly executed. Failure meant not just embarrassment, but social rejection. So the next time you grumble about your stylist taking too long or charging too much, remember the ancient hairdressers who worked in the flickering light of oil lamps, dealing with not just hair, but status, superstition, and societal expectations. Their humble tools were weapons of social navigation, their fingers artists and arbiters of identity. Hairstyles weren't mere vanity. They were complex languages, spoken strand by strand, braid by braid, telling stories of power, place, and personal destiny just out of reach for those who only see a haircut. And behind every stiff wig, every elaborately coiled topknot or cascading braid, was a craftsman or craftswoman whose labor whispered of the invisible hands that shaped ancient societies, far more than historians' dusty tomes ever could. A hairstyle wasn't just hair, it was a statement, a strategy, a declaration. Hairdressers weren't just workers, they were architects of identity, etched not in stone, but in silk ribbon, beeswax, and bone combs. Through their art, the past speaks, loud and clear, even if the styles themselves have long since faded with time. Imagine stepping into an ancient gallery where time has frozen the whispers of daily life. Only here, the protagonists aren't kings, warriors, or gods alone. They are the intricate coils of hair, braids knotted tight like secret messages locked in a crown of tresses. Hair in ancient times was far from a mere accessory. It was a carefully crafted statement, a silent communicator, etched in stone, painted on walls, and sung about in the epics, echoing through dusty halls. Look closely at a Greek vase, a Roman fresco, or an Egyptian relief, and you'll find hairstyles that do more than decorate. They narrate. Each curl, braid, and topknot carries layers of meaning, a symbolic language understood at a glance by anyone who could read the visual codes of the era. These hairstyles weren't random or just about vanity. No, they were social badges, religious declarations, marital status indicators, and even political advertisements, all rolled into one coiffured package. Take the towering powdered wigs of the later European courts. Striking, sure, but they come centuries after the real ancient hair drama unfolds. Let's zoom in on the sources that immortalize the primeval hair play, art, and literature. The old masters of storytelling didn't just talk about hair, they framed it as essential cultural lexicon. Homer's Iliad, for instance, doesn't waste ink on battles without first setting the scene with descriptions of heroic warriors' locks. Achilles, for instance, is often described with flowing hair that exhibits both his youth and divine favor, whereas the grim visage of Agamemnon features a different kind of styled authority. But beyond literary mentions, physical art offers a more permanent glimpse. Egyptian tomb paintings famously capture the elaborate wigs and braided styles reserved for pharaohs and priests, each curl and coil a signifier of rank, purity, or protective magic. The ancient Egyptians even believed that hair could contain the essence of the individual, cutting it shaved away, not just physical strands, but symbolic power. Imagine how shocking it must have been to see a pharaoh disgraced by shaving his iconic wig as an act of humiliation. Meanwhile, in the classical world, statues of deities and mortals alike immortalize coiffures with striking detail. Carefully chiseled ringlets cascading down marble shoulders, arranged in symmetric patterns that hint at idealized beauty and social virtue. Roman frescoes from Pompeii don't lag behind. They splash vivid colors that highlight intricate braids, woven not just for ornament, but to signal age, social rank, and even political allegiance. Some hairstyles were the ancient equivalent of walking billboards, screaming aristocrat or servant, citizen or foreigner, all in one glance. If ancient art was a silent language, then literature was its poetic interpreter. Epics, plays, and poems often depict hair as a sacred extension of the self, or a symbol of divine favor and personal tragedy. The story of Samson from the Hebrew Bible is the dramatic centerpiece of hair's power, where the loss of a single lock leads to the collapse of strength and hope. It's the ultimate cautionary tale. Mess with the hair, and you might just mess with fate. Elsewhere, hair features in ritualistic and martial contexts. Consider the samurai in ancient Japan, who carefully crafted their topknots not just for style, but as a symbol of honor and readiness for battle. While the samurai themselves are post-ancient, the idea of hairstyles serving as markers of identity and status goes back millennia across multiple cultures. Ancient Mediterranean warriors, for example, would shave parts of their heads or braid their hair before battle, not just for practical reasons like keeping cool, but to mark their courage and readiness. Braids and shaved patches became visual hashtags of bravery, extendable into social bonding ceremonies. Even the sacred and profane jostled for space in this ancient hair theater. Virgin priestesses might wear their hair untouched and flowing, a symbol of purity and divine favor, while soldiers or consorts displayed complex, sometimes borderline theatrical styles to mark their roles in society. And then there were those who defied convention, cutting their hair short as a symbol of mourning, loss, or political protest. Ancient hair as the original social media statement, only far more permanent. What fascinates is how this symbolic language of hair transcends mere aesthetics to reflect deeper social codes. Hairstyles encoded everything from marital status to ethnic identity, gender expectations, religious devotion, and even economic standing. The messy, unkempt hair might signal a grieving widow. An elaborate, braided crown could shout "Queen" across a crowded marketplace. So next time you breeze past an old fresco, a statue, or a dusty scroll, remember, those ancient strands weren't just strands. They were conversations, broadcast loud and clear in the silent media of stone and paint, a woven language of identity where one misstep in styling could mean exile, disgrace, or worse, while the perfect curl might mark you as favored by gods and men alike. In this world, hair was both armor and declaration, a social contract tangled into every twist, braid, and topknot, not just fashion, but a visual dialect that defined ancient lives. And it's that language, surprisingly rich and vivid, that still speaks to us today, whispering tales of ancient identity, one strand at a time. Imagine a scalp that's more than just skin and follicles. a battleground, a political statement, a cultural billboard, all rolled into one. Hairstyles in ancient times weren't just about vanity or keeping bugs at bay. They were intricately woven declarations of power shifts, conquests, and identity crises long before Instagram filters or celebrity stylists made it trendy. As empires toppled and tribes merged, so too did the strands of history intertwine in braids, waves, and towering topknots, reflecting a world in constant flux. Take the towering wigs of Hellenistic rulers after Alexander the Great's conquests. Here's a guy who spread Greek influence like wildfire, stamping culture across 3 continents. But the conquering didn't end with swords and spears. It trickled into the hairs of his successors. Greek kings in Egypt, like the Ptolemies, adopted elaborate, almost theatrical hairstyles that fused Greek curls with Egyptian braids. Those voluminous curls weren't just vanity projects. They signified a ruler's claim to both Greek heritage and Egyptian divinity. Wearing such a wig was like sporting a crown made of cultural hybridity, a walking, talking billboard for political savvy. Which begs the question, if your hairstyle could speak, would it yell conquest or compromise? Over in Rome, hair was an even messier affair. The Republic gave way to an empire, and the shift was mirrored in hairdos that grew increasingly elaborate and, frankly, ridiculous by modern standards. Empresses like Julia Domna and Agrippina the Younger took the concept of big hair don't care to epic heights. Their towering coiffures, riddled with curls, braids, and decorative pins, weren't just about catching the envious gaze of rivals. They broadcasted social status, allegiance, and, occasionally, a hunger for power. Political upheaval often forced patrons to rethink their hair game lest they fall out of favor, or worse, into exile. And let's not forget the subtle, or not so subtle, messages conveyed when enemies were forced to shave their heads, a humiliating sign of defeat and loss of status, proof that hair had become a currency in the game of power. But the story takes an even more fascinating twist with the Silk Road, where cultural exchanges transformed hairstyles into hybrid spectacles reflecting distant lands. As merchants, soldiers, and diplomats traversed continents, they carried more than silk and spices. Hairstyles became subtle nods to new alliances and assimilations. Central Asian nomads adopted Persian-influenced braiding techniques, incorporating intricate patterns that doubled as tribal identifiers, a hairstyle serving both as a fashion statement and secret code. Those top knots and plaits weren't just practical for horseback riding. They cataloged lineage, loyalty, and sometimes the wearer's marital status. Imagine whipping your hair back into a knot and instantly announcing your tribe, social class, and political standing all at once. Not bad for a simple hairstyle. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the Han Dynasty saw hairstyles entangled with shifting political tides. Emperors favored certain hair arrangements that distinguished the imperial court from the common folk. elaborate updos, often adorned with jade pins and silk ribbons, were not just signs of aesthetic refinement, but clear markers of bureaucratic rank and allegiance to the throne. The peasantry, meanwhile, sported simpler styles, functional and unpretentious, a silent rebellion against the ornate customs of rulers who were busy amassing power. Yet every once in a while, spikes of rebellion flickered through hairstyles, with some subcultures deliberately sporting styles that defied imperial decrees, turning hair into a quiet battlefield of resistance. Then there's the paradox of wigs in ancient times, especially in Egypt and Rome. On one hand, wigs allowed wearers to maintain the illusion of eternal youth and divine favor, essential in courts where aging was career suicide. On the other, they became symbols of wealth and exclusivity, so ostentatious they might make even modern celebrity stylists blush. The act of donning a wig was a social performance, often requiring entire servants just to prepare and maintain the voluminous creations. These wigs weren't just hair replacements, they were caricatures of power, larger-than-life statements demanding attention and respect. Refuse to wear one in court, and you might as well have shown up in sweatpants. Yet, hairstyles also betrayed moments of vulnerability and transformation. The practice of shaving heads in certain cultures wasn't merely punishment or humiliation, it was often a rite of passage, a cleansing of old identities to forge new ones in the fires of political change. Conquered peoples might find their traditional hair customs outlawed by new regimes intent on cultural assimilation. In some cases, forced adoption of the conqueror's hairstyles acted as psychological warfare, stripping away cultural pride one strand at a time. The Mongol Empire's rise, for instance, imposed specific haircuts on subjugated peoples designed to erase old tribes and forge loyalty to the Khan. Haircuts could be a brutal form of control. It sounds trivial, but in reality, controlling a people's hair was akin to controlling their self-image and, by extension, their will. What's most striking across all these cultures is the fluidity of hair as a cultural and political canvas. One generation's rebellious breed became the next's establishment style. A particular twist of hair that once symbolized submission could evolve into a proud marker of identity and resistance decades later. Hair was not merely biological. It was an ever-shifting script written by victors, rebels, and survivors, where every lock told a story of conquest, adaptation, and sometimes defiance. In this intricate tapestry of wigs, braids, and topknots, hair serves as a living record of age-old human dramas. Each strand reflects shifting allegiances, clashing empires, absorbing cultures, and relentless human desire to be seen and remembered, not just for who they are, but who they dared to pretend to be, in a world where power truly is skin deep. So next time you brush a strand behind your ear or fret over a bad hair day, remember, Somewhere deep in history, your hairstyle might have been a declaration of empire, identity, and survival. Not bad for something so often taken for granted. There's something undeniably magnetic about the way ancient hairstyles have echoed down the centuries, refusing to be mere whispers of the past, but rather roaring into the present with surprising vitality. Think about the braided crowns that once adorned queens and warriors, not just fancy hairdos, but intricate symbols of power, lineage, and social standing. Today, those very braids sashay down red carpets and flood Instagram feeds, worn not just for fashion, but as proud declarations of identity and heritage. It's as if those woven strands carry a secret message, a cultural DNA strand, looping through time. Take the top knot, for instance. In many ancient societies, the top knot wasn't just a haircut, it was a badge of honor, a spiritual tether to the gods, or a marker of warrior status. The samurai's chanmage, the noble Sumerian priests' coiffures, even the Nordic chieftains' proud crests, all told stories as loudly as any speech. Fast forward to today, and the top knot has morphed into a trendy, sometimes ironic, sometimes proud hairstyle. Hipsters sport it while sipping fair trade coffee, while some indigenous communities reclaim it as a vibrant link to ancestral strength. It's wild, isn't it? How a half-messy knot loops through millennia to yell, "I've got roots you can't shake." In rituals around the world, hair still commands a kind of mystical authority. From the Maasai warriors barbering their heads before battle, to the Sufi dervishes in their symbolic hair ties, to countless indigenous groups treating hair as a living repository of spiritual energy. Hair communicates codes beyond mere aesthetics. Cutting or styling hair can mark rites of passage, social transformations, or spiritual rebirth. This isn't just ancient superstition, it's a conversation between the physical and the metaphysical. The scalp becomes a canvas, each cut and coil a deliberate phrase in the storytelling of selfhood. Modern fashion might seem drastically different on the surface, with its ever-accelerating cycles of new looks, but peek beneath the shiny veneer and you'll find that many trends are radical reinventions of ancient scripts. Dreadlocks, cornrows, afros, they are hairstyles saturated with history and defiance. For centuries, they endured suppression and stigmatization, only to explode back into cultural pride and political statements. When a young person today chooses to wear their hair in these styles, they're not only making a fashion choice, they're wielding a centuries-old symbol of resistance, identity, and resilience, a silent yet loud protest against cultural erasure. And let's not overlook the political theater that hair has staged in recent decades. Hair became a battleground for identity politics, a front line where assimilation clashed with preservation. Think of the school policies that once banned natural hairstyles, or corporate dress codes that insisted on professional looks by the dominant culture's standards. These battles are about much more than grooming. They're about recognition, respect, and self-definition. Ancient hair symbols, reclaimed and reinterpreted, have become powerful tools in these cultural skirmishes, signaling pride, demanding acceptance, and rewriting unwelcome narratives. Even in the world of haute couture and celebrity culture, the past is never far away. Designers reach deep into history, plundering the symbolic toolbox of braids, twists, and buns to conjure imagery of strength, femininity, or rebellion. When Beyoncé dons a braided crown evoking ancient African queens, it's not coincidence or a mere aesthetic flair. It's a deliberate act of cultural storytelling, an homage to forgotten rulers who once commanded empires with those very braids. The same goes for the punk scene's razor-sharp mohawks, which owe en mode to the ancient warriors who shaved parts of their heads as masks of intimidation, signaling readiness for battle and rejection of convention. Sometimes it's amusing to consider that what was once deeply sacred and ritualistic becomes a trend that lasts a hot minute before Instagram's algorithm moves on. But even in the ephemerality of fashion, these ancient styles carry echoes that endure. A vampire chic topknot may be fleeting, but the symbolism behind it, power, spirituality, identity, remains potent, fueling countless reinventions. It's as if hair itself is alive, a shape-shifting entity that bridges the past and the present, mixing the sacred with the profane, the personal with the political. What's truly fascinating is how hair continues to serve as a silent language for marginalized voices. For many, wearing an ancient hairstyle is a reclaiming of stolen histories, a stepping onto a stage and saying, without words, "I belong here. I remember where I came from." It's not just about looking good. It's about healing, visibility, and rewriting history from the ground up, with every braid and coil acting as a letter, a word, a manifesto. So, when you see someone rocking a thick braid cascading down their back, a sleek top knot, or an intricate pattern of cornrows, ask yourself, what stories are woven into those strands? What battles have those styles survived, and what new meanings are they spinning today? Hairstyles are no longer, if they ever were, just about hair. They are living, breathing archives of human culture, identity, and power, tangled, braided, twisted, and knotted into the very fabric of who we are. In the end, ancient hairstyles remind us that what's on our heads can carry the weight of history, culture, politics, and pride. They're more than aesthetic choices. They're declarations, rebellions, ceremonies, and survival tools. When history looks at us through the prism of hairstyles, it sees not just strands of hair, but strands of stories, holding tight across time like the strongest braid, unyielding and endlessly captivating. Hairstyles, once dismissed by some as mere vanity or fleeting fashion, carry power, raw, unfiltered, and often revolutionary. For centuries, ancient wigs, braids, and topknots weren't just about looking good. They were living languages, coded messages etched in hair. Today, those old rhythms of curl and coil, twist and turn, are roaring back with a vengeance, reclaiming lost ground and flipping the script on what identity means. Take a stroll through any major city, New York, Lagos, Johannesburg, Paris, and you'll notice a vibrant tapestry of hair artistry flourishing among young people and elders alike. It's not just a style, it's a statement. These hairstyles are a bold middle finger to colonial histories that tried and often failed to erase or sanitize cultural identities. Reclaiming ancient hairstyling practices has become a front line in a broader movement to assert heritage, pride, and resistance. Consider the African continent, where braids and cornrows aren't just protective styles, but repositories of ancestral knowledge. Each pattern, meticulously woven, can signal tribe, social status, marital status, sometimes even whispered messages of escape. In past centuries, enslaved Africans braided maps and messages into their hair to outwit their captors, a silent act of rebellion and survival. Today's revival of these styles isn't just about aesthetics, it's an act of remembering and rewriting history. A way to say, we were here and we will endure. This isn't nostalgia or simply a fashion revival. It's radical identity politics. When Black Americans rock box braids, twists, or dreadlocks, they're tapping into centuries of cultural resilience. It's hair that resists assimilation pressures, straightened cones, and the good hair standards imposed painfully by systemic racism. The natural hair movement, with all its social media hashtags and salon gatherings, is more than hair care. It's a declaration of self-love, a rejection of Eurocentric beauty ideals, and a reclaiming of heritage. It's pride curling out from roots as deep as the transatlantic slave trade. But this resurgence isn't confined to African diasporas. Indigenous communities from North America to Australia are reawakening their own ancient hair traditions with fierce determination. For many Native American tribes, hair is sacred, a physical embodiment of spirituality, strength, and connection to the earth. Long hair was once worn as a symbol of harmony with nature and tribal identity, but decades of oppressive policies forced many to cut it, often forcibly removing it as a tool of cultural genocide. Now, growing and breeding hair is both a healing ritual and a political act. It's a silent protest asserting sovereignty and cultural survival in the face of historical erasure. Even in Asia, ancient top knots and intricate coiffures, once the domain of emperors, samurai, and court dancers, are inspiring a contemporary renaissance. Young people rediscover these styles not just as cosplay accessories or Instagram aesthetics, but as meaningful connections to centuries-old stories of honor, resilience, and artful resistance against ever-changing political tides. What's fascinating is how these styles transcend mere looks. They become living, breathing symbols of identity negotiation in an increasingly globalized, homogenized world. Wearing a traditional hairstyle today sends a complex message. I honor my ancestors. I defy erasure. And I'm not bending to dominant cultural norms. It's a complex personal and political dance, woven into strands of hair shaped by history's heavy hands. And there's a beautiful irony here. Where colonial administrations once criminalized certain hairstyles, banning dreadlocks, punishing braids, and forcing hair straightening in schools and workplaces as coded attempts to suppress cultural identity. Today, these hairstyles thrive on digital platforms and in public spaces as badges of honor and rebellion. Hair salons become cultural hubs and crisis clinics. Social media explodes with tutorials and celebrations. The very tools once used to assimilate and erase are repurposed to empower and educate. This renaissance touches everyone, even those far removed from the cultures that birthed these styles. The symbolic language of ancient hairstyles invites curiosity, admiration, and sometimes appropriation, but when handled with respect, it fosters cross-cultural understanding and connection. It reminds us that hair, like language or ceremony, carries deep meanings that deserve to be honored, not commodified. So, the next time you catch a flash of a sharply braided scalp or a high, elegant top knot on the street, remember, this isn't just about grooming, it's about survival, pride, and resistance written in hair. These strands speak louder than words ever could, threading ancient stories into modern struggles, reminding us that identity is not a static thing, but a living tapestry woven through time. In this sense, ancient hairstyles have never really gone out of style. They've been quietly waiting, simmering beneath the surface, until the world caught up to the fierce, unbreakable spirit locked inside every twist, braid, and knot. And now, more than ever, those ancient symbols are speaking up, demanding to be seen and heard, curling their way back into the spotlight with all the drama, grace, and defiance they've always possessed. Hairstyles have always been more than just hair. They are a language, a complex, silent vocabulary spoken without words, yet understood across continents and centuries. From the intricate braids of ancient Africa to the towering powdered wigs of European courts, each strand carried meaning. Was your hair a badge of honor, a status symbol, or a declaration of rebellion? Quite often, it was all three, sometimes simultaneously. Imagine a society where your hairstyle could determine your fate, mark your social rank, or even betray your loyalties without a single syllable exchanged. It sounds like something lifted from a strange dystopian novel, but this was everyday reality for millions throughout history. The choice to wear your hair short or long, braided or loose, shaved or piled high, was never just about style. It was about identity, power, and control. In many cultures, hair was sacred. The Native American tribes saw hair as an extension of the soul. Cutting it meant mourning or loss. Growing it long signified strength and wisdom. But that reverence also came with rules, often rigid and unforgiving. For the Iroquois, warriors announced their readiness for battle through hairstyles, shaved heads with a single scalp lock, waving like a battle flag. It was hair as a warning shot, a psychological weapon more effective than any spear. Cross the ocean to ancient Egypt, where hair wasn't just symbolic, but ritualistic. Pharaohs sported elaborate wigs that shimmered under the desert sun, a clear sign of divine authority. But these wigs were more than accessories. They were shields against spiritual decay and physical heat, melding practicality with profound symbolism. When you saw that perfectly coiled, ebony black crown, you weren't just looking at fashion, you were gazing upon the embodiment of godly rule itself. The commoners cast their eyes upward, realizing that the wig wasn't just decoration, it was a statement carved in ebony and gold. And then there were the Vikings, those rugged proto-hair metalheads whose hairstyle screamed, "I'm about to pillage your village." Their often elaborate braids weren't for aesthetics alone, but for practicality in battle and a mark of identity. Did they keep hidden messages in those braids? Perhaps. Their hair was as much a part of their armor as their axes, sending signals of rank and valor. A Viking couldn't just roll out of bed with a messy mop of hair. That would be defeat before the first swing. Fast forward to the pomp and ceremony of 18th century Europe, where powdered wigs reached absurd heights, sometimes literally towering feet above the head like architectural marvels that would make skyscraper engineers jealous. These wigs were a cocktail of fashion, politics, and societal hierarchy, signaling everything from one's enough money to hire a dedicated wig maestro status to one's political allegiance. Losing your wig in those times wasn't just embarrassing, it was a social catastrophe. Imagine stepping into a courtroom or royal gathering, and your carefully sculpted hairpiece topples in front of everyone. Death by ridicule was probably merciful compared to that nightmare. But beyond war, royalty, and court intrigue, hairstyles also served as subtle rebellion. Throughout history, marginalized peoples and subcultures have used hair as a form of protest, insisting on their identity when everything else tried to erase it. Consider the afro in the 1960s and 70s, a lush, defiant crown proclaiming pride and resistance against assimilation and oppression. It was a symbol heavy with meaning, capable of sparking fear in the hearts of the establishment and hope in the hearts of those seeking equality. Hair, in this sense, becomes a battlefield on the scalp, a physical manifestation of cultural struggle. Today, in an era of seemingly endless hairstyling options, it's easy to overlook this past, to think of hair as just hair. But in truth, every braid, curl, and cut laces us into a lineage of expression that stretches back tens of thousands of years. How many moments of human history have hinged on a hairstyle? How many glances, judgments, or alliances have been forged or broken in the flick of a keratin strand? The answer is more than we might like to admit. In our selfies and social media selfies lies a lineage of stories that echoes ancient tribal signals, royal commands, and rebellious protests. When you rush to try that new haircut, teasing your hair into wild spikes, glossy waves, or structured topknots, you're participating in a ritual older than recorded history. Your reflection is a canvas, your hair the brush, painting symbols that say, "This is who I am. This is what I stand for. Look and understand me." So, next time you run your fingers through your hair, pause. Consider the 1,000-year tapestry woven into each strand. Hairstyling isn't just vanity. It's a symbolic dance between who we are and who we want to be, between personal identity and collective culture. It's power and protest, submission and sovereignty, all tangled together in one magical, mysterious language, invisible yet impossible to ignore. In a world increasingly defined by digital masks and curated images, perhaps hair remains one of the last authentic messengers of our true selves, drifting through history like a silent yet eloquent testimony to human complexity. Sometimes subtle, sometimes outrageous, often misunderstood, hairstyles speak without words, yet say everything. After all, when it comes to communication, isn't it ironic that the stories told by hair have woven themselves into the very fabric of what it means to be human?